The fog rolls in thick across the dark water. Ice floats in jagged sheets. Waves crash against black volcanic rock. The sky is gray, endless, merging with the sea until there is no horizon. This is East Greenland, one of the most remote and unforgiving places on Earth. For thousands of years, the Inuit people survived here. They hunted seals in the freezing water. They traveled along coastlines where fog could last for weeks, where ice could shift overnight, where a single wrong turn could mean death. And yet, they never got lost. They navigated these waters with something that seems impossible. Not a compass, not a written map, not even stars or sun to guide them through the endless Arctic fog. They used wooden carvings. Small pieces of driftwood, palm-sized, carved with ridges and curves that seemed abstract, meaningless to outsiders. But to the Inuit, these objects were maps. Detailed, accurate, three-dimensional maps that could be read in total darkness. Maps that could guide a kayak through hundreds of miles of coastline without a single mistake. Maps that were never meant to be looked at. They were meant to be felt. This is the story of the Ammassalik wooden maps. A navigation system so advanced, so perfectly adapted to its environment, that when European explorers first encountered it in the 1880s, they could barely understand what they were seeing. How did a culture without writing, without formal cartography, create maps more precise than anything Europeans had made of the same region? How did they encode an entire coastline into ridges carved on driftwood? And why did this knowledge vanish so quickly after contact with the outside world? This is a mystery of human ingenuity, of survival, of a way of knowing the world that was never written down, never taught in schools, never preserved in books. A way of knowing that existed in the hands of the Inuit, in their memory, in their relationship with the land and sea. And it began in one of the coldest, most isolated places humans have ever called home. East Greenland is not a place where humans were meant to live. The coastline stretches for over 1,500 miles. Mountains rise straight from the ocean, their peaks covered in ice year-round. Glaciers carve through valleys, calving icebergs the size of buildings into the freezing sea. The weather is brutal. Storms come without warning. Fog blankets the water for days, sometimes weeks. Temperatures drop below freezing even in summer. Pack ice drifts along the coast, closing off entire bays overnight. Navigation here is almost impossible. There are no roads, no landmarks that stay visible through the fog. The coastline twists and turns in a labyrinth of fjords, bays, and islands. One wrong turn, and you could be trapped between moving ice and sheer cliff walls. For most of human history, this region was considered uninhabitable, but the Inuit didn't see it that way. They saw a coastline rich with seals, fish, and whales. They saw fjords that provided shelter from storms. They saw ice that could be read, understood, predicted. They built a life here. The Ammassalik Inuit, also known as the East Greenland Inuit, settled in this region over 1,000 years ago. Their main settlement was near what is now Ammassalik, a small town on the eastern coast. But they didn't stay in one place. They moved constantly, following the seals, following the ice, following the rhythms of the Arctic seasons. To survive, they had to know the coastline better than anyone in history. Every bay, every reef, every submerged rock, every island hidden in the fog. Because here, knowledge wasn't just power, it was survival. The Ammassalik Inuit were hunters. Their lives revolved around the sea. They hunted ringed seals, bearded seals, and occasionally narwhals. They fished Arctic char in the fjords. In winter, they hunted on the ice. In summer, they traveled in kayaks made from driftwood and sealskin. These kayaks were small, fast, and nearly silent on the water. A skilled hunter could paddle for hours without making a sound. They used harpoons tipped with bone or walrus ivory. They wore waterproof parkas made from seal intestines. Everything they used came from the land and sea around them. But survival wasn't just about hunting skill. It was about knowledge. The Inuit didn't have writing. They didn't have formal schools or written records. But they had something more powerful: oral tradition. Knowledge was passed down through stories, songs, and direct teaching. Elders taught children how to read the ice, how to predict weather by watching the clouds, how to find seals by listening to the water. They learned the coastline by traveling it, over and over, year after year, until every curve, every rock, every shallow reef was memorized. But memory alone wasn't enough, because in the Arctic, conditions change constantly. Fog rolls in, ice shifts, storms arrive, and when you're in a kayak miles from shore, with no sun and no stars to guide you, memory can fail. You need something more reliable. You need a map, but not the kind of map Europeans used. The Inuit needed something that worked in the dark, something that worked in the fog, something that could be used with frozen hands, in a rocking kayak, in the middle of a storm. So they invented something no one else in the world had ever made: a map you could read with your fingertips. In 1884, a Danish naval officer named Gustav Holm led an expedition to East Greenland. At the time, the Ammassalik region was one of the last unmapped areas of Greenland. European explorers had tried to reach it for decades, but the pack ice made it nearly impossible. Ships couldn't get through. The coastline was too dangerous. But Holm was determined. He traveled by dogs led along the ice, then by boat along the coast. His goal was to make contact with the Inuit people living there and to map the region for the Danish government. What he found surprised him. The Ammassalik Inuit were thriving. They lived in small, scattered settlements along the fjords. They were friendly, curious about the outsiders, and completely self-sufficient. And they had something Holm had never seen before: wooden carvings. At first, he thought they were decorative. Small pieces of driftwood, carved with abstract patterns. Ridges and grooves running along the surface. Some were flat, like rulers. Others were curved, almost sculptural. But when Holm asked what they were, the Inuit explained. These were maps. Holm was skeptical. They didn't look like any map he'd ever seen. There were no symbols, no labels, no scale, just carved lines. But the Inuit demonstrated. They held the wood in their hands. They ran their fingers along the ridges. And they explained that each ridge represented a section of the coastline. Each curve was a fjord. Each notch was a bay or island. The maps were tactile, three-dimensional, encoded in a way that could be felt, not seen. Holm was astonished. He purchased several of these wooden maps and brought them back to Denmark. They were studied by anthropologists and cartographers, and when they compared the carvings to actual surveys of the East Greenland coast, they found something incredible. The maps were accurate, shockingly accurate. The ridges matched the real coastline almost perfectly. Peninsulas, islands, all carved in precise proportion. Some maps covered over 100 miles of coastline, with details down to individual reefs and rocks. And the Inuit had made them without compasses, without instruments, without any formal training in cartography. They had made them by memory, by experience, by touch. The Ammassalik wooden maps are unlike anything else in the history of navigation. Most maps are visual. They use symbols, lines, and colors to represent space. You look at them. You interpret them with your eyes. But the Ammassalik maps were designed to be felt. Each map was carved from a single piece of driftwood. Driftwood was abundant along the Greenland coast, carried south by ocean currents from Siberia and Alaska. It was lightweight, durable, and easy to carve. The Inuit used knives made from bone, stone, or later, metal traded from Europeans. They carved the coastline into the wood, ridge by ridge. The technique was simple but precise. Each raised ridge represented a stretch of coastline. The shape of the ridge followed the contours of the land. If the coast curved inward into a bay, the ridge curved inward. If a peninsula jutted out, the ridge jutted out. Islands were represented as separate notches or blocks. Shallow reefs were marked with smaller grooves. River mouths, landing sites, and dangerous areas were often indicated with subtle changes in texture. Some maps were linear, like a strip. They represented a single journey along the coast, reading from one end to the other. Others were more complex, with multiple pieces that fit together. A hunter might carry 3 or 4 wooden pieces, each representing a different section of coastline. Together, they formed a complete map of the region. The genius of the system was its adaptability. In fog, when you couldn't see the shore, you could hold the map in your hand and run your fingers along it. You could feel where you were based on the ridges. If you felt a sharp inward curve, you knew a deep fjord was ahead. If you felt a series of small notches, you knew you were passing a cluster of islands. The maps worked in total darkness. They worked with frozen fingers. They worked in a rocking kayak, in the middle of a storm, with waves crashing over the bow. They were waterproof. They didn't tear. They didn't fade. And because they were three-dimensional, they carried more information than a flat drawing ever could. Some of the wooden maps had carvings on both sides. One side represented the coastline as seen from the water. The other side represented the inland geography, mountains, valleys, glaciers. This dual perspective was critical, because in the Arctic, navigation isn't just about following the shore. It's about understanding the entire landscape, knowing which fjord leads where, knowing which valleys are safe to cross, knowing where the ice will break first in spring. The Inuit didn't just make maps. They made a complete, tactile model of their world. The Ammassalik wooden maps are not the only tactile navigation system ever invented. Across the Pacific Ocean, Polynesian navigators used stick charts. These were made from coconut fibers and shells, tied together in geometric patterns. The sticks represented ocean swells. The shells represented islands. Navigators used them to understand wave patterns and find land across thousands of miles of open water. The Polynesians were some of the greatest navigators in history. They crossed the Pacific without compasses, without written maps, using only their knowledge of stars, currents, and waves. But the stick charts were different from the Ammassalik maps. Stick charts were abstract. They represented patterns, not literal geography. They taught principles of navigation, not specific routes. The Ammassalik maps, by contrast, were literal. They represented real coastlines in precise detail. You could trace your exact location, mile by mile, with your fingertips. Vikings, too, had sophisticated navigation techniques. They used sunstones, crystals that could detect polarized light, to navigate on cloudy days. They had mental maps of ocean routes, passed down through oral tradition. They understood wind, currents, and seasonal migration patterns. But Vikings didn't carve their maps. Their knowledge stayed in memory, in song, in story. It was never encoded in a physical object you could hold. Native Alaskans, particularly the Yupik and Inupiat peoples, also used tactile navigation tools. They carved ivory pieces with maps of river systems and coastal routes. These carvings were similar to the Ammassalik maps in concept: portable, durable, tactile. But the Ammassalik maps were more detailed. They covered larger areas, and they used a three-dimensional encoding system that captured the full complexity of the East Greenland coast. In the history of human navigation, the Ammassalik wooden maps stand alone. They are the most sophisticated tactile cartography system ever documented, and they were created by a culture that never developed writing. To understand the Ammassalik maps, you have to understand how the Inuit thought about space. For most modern people, navigation is visual. We look at a map on a screen. We follow arrows. We watch landmarks pass by. But for the Inuit, navigation was embodied. It wasn't about looking. It was about feeling. When an Inuit hunter traveled along the coast, they didn't just see the land. They felt it. The rhythm of the waves. The sound of water hitting rock. The way the wind shifted near a bay. The smell of kelp and seaweed drying on shore. They learned the coastline with their whole body. And when they carved a map, they weren't creating an abstract representation. They were creating a physical memory, a way to hold the coastline in their hands. The maps were teaching tools. Young hunters learned to navigate by tracing the ridges with their fingers. They memorized the shape of the coast through touch. By the time they were old enough to travel alone, they didn't need the map anymore. The knowledge was inside them. But the map was still useful, because even experienced hunters could forget, or get disoriented, or find themselves in an unfamiliar area. The wooden map was a backup, a reference, a way to reconnect with the knowledge they already carried. This philosophy, navigation as embodied knowledge, is rare in the modern world. We've outsourced navigation to technology. We trust screens and satellites more than our own senses. But the Inuit had no choice. They had to trust themselves. They had to know the land so deeply that it became part of them. And the wooden maps were the bridge between memory and reality. They were proof that human knowledge doesn't need writing to be precise. It doesn't need computers to be accurate. It just needs care, attention, and a deep relationship with the world around you. When Gustav Holm brought the Ammassalik wooden maps back to Denmark, cartographers were stunned. They compared the carvings to their own surveys of the East Greenland coast. Surveys made with compasses, sextants, and modern instruments. And the wooden maps matched. Not approximately, not vaguely. They matched precisely. Bays lined up. Peninsulas were the right length. Islands were in the correct positions. Even small details, reefs, river mouths, shallow areas, were carved with shocking accuracy. How was this possible? The Inuit didn't have measuring tools. They didn't have theodolites or telescopes. They didn't use triangulation or GPS. They used observation, repetition, and an unparalleled understanding of scale. Inuit hunters traveled the same routes year after year. They passed the same landmarks hundreds of times. They learned the coastline not as a map, but as a lived experience. When they carved a map, they weren't copying from a drawing. They were translating memory into wood. And because that memory was so precise, refined over a lifetime of travel, the carvings were precise too. There's also evidence that the Inuit used relative measurement. They didn't need to know exact distances in miles or kilometers. They knew how long it took to paddle from one point to another. They knew how the coastline looked from different angles. They knew which features were visible from which positions on the water. All of this information was encoded in the ridges. The maps weren't just pictures. They were functional tools built from direct experience. And that's why they worked. Because they weren't abstract. They were real. By the early 1900s, the Ammassalik wooden maps had almost completely disappeared. The tradition of carving them faded within a single generation. Why? The answer is contact. When Gustav Holm arrived in 1884, he was one of the first Europeans to make sustained contact with the Ammassalik Inuit. But he wouldn't be the last. Danish missionaries followed, then traders, then colonial administrators. The Danish government established a permanent presence in East Greenland. They built schools. They introduced Christianity. They encouraged the Inuit to settle in permanent villages instead of following seasonal migration routes. And with those changes came new technology: paper maps, compasses, written navigation instructions. Suddenly, the wooden maps seemed outdated, primitive, unnecessary. Young Inuit were taught to read European-style maps in school. They were taught to navigate with compasses and charts. The old ways were seen as relics of the past. Within a generation, the knowledge faded. Elders who knew how to carve the maps grew old and died. Their children never learned the skill. The oral tradition broke. By the 1920s, almost no one in East Greenland was making wooden maps anymore. A few were preserved in museums. Gustav Holm's collection ended up in the National Museum of Denmark. A few other examples were collected by anthropologists and explorers, but the living tradition was gone. Today, there are only about 20 known Ammassalik wooden maps left in the world. Most are in European museums. A few are in private collections. None are still used for navigation. The knowledge they represent, thousands of years of accumulated understanding, exists now only as museum artifacts. And that loss is profound, because the Ammassalik maps weren't just tools. They were a way of thinking, a way of knowing the world, a relationship with the land that was passed down through generations. When that knowledge disappeared, something irreplaceable was lost.